Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking the fascinating, tragic, and honestly complex history behind Scottish football's most intense rivalry. You know, when most people hear the names Celtic and Rangers, they instantly think of fierce sporting competition, bitter sectarian divides, and just this unmatched dominance over Scottish football. But the roots of this division actually have very little to do with football, and literally everything to do with the physical geography of Glasgow.
So let's just dive right into this explainer with what sounds like a kind of bizarre question. How did a shallow stretch of water literally divide a city and lay the groundwork for the old firm? It's an incredible story of how nature dictated where people lived, where they worked, and eventually who they cheered for on a Saturday afternoon.
Section 1. A city divided by water.
Okay, so to really get this rivalry, we first have to wrap our heads around the geography of 18th and 19th century Glasgow. Way before it was this massive modern metropolis, Glasgow was a rapidly industrializing town, and it was split right down the middle by the River Clyde. At low tide, the river was historically just 15 inches deep in places. I mean, that is barely enough to cover a boot, but its muddy, 100-meter-wide span formed this incredibly stubborn physical barrier. There were very few bridges around, and ferry tolls were just too expensive for the working class. So because of this 15-inch obstacle, people were forced to live exactly where they worked, keeping communities entirely isolated from one another on opposite banks of the river.
Basically, geography forced distinct populations into completely separate working-class worlds. On the East End, you had textile mills and foundries. When the Irish potato famine hit in the 1840s, tens of thousands of desperate Catholic refugees settled here out of sheer necessity. Meanwhile, over on the South Bank, specifically in Govan, you had the booming shipyards. And these yards attracted Ulster Protestant workers, who brought with them a completely different cultural identity. So you have two distinct communities, separated by water, building two very different foundations for the city's future football giants.
Section 2. Birth of the Old Firm. Moving away from the banks of the Clyde and onto the football pitch, let's look at how these isolated communities actually birthed the sporting institutions that would eventually collide. And what's truly fascinating here is the stark contrast in their origins. Rangers was founded in 1872 by 4 teenagers whose primary goal was, well, simply to play a new, exciting sport. They had no initial religious or political leanings whatsoever. Celtic, on the other hand, was founded 15 years later in 1887 by a Marist brother named Brother Walfrid. His goal wasn't just sporting, it was a literal charitable lifeline to raise funds for a children's dinner table in the starving, impoverished East End. Eventually, their frequent and highly profitable matches led a satirical magazine to publish a cartoon in 1904, calling them the Old Firm, purely because of the mutual commercial benefits they reaped from playing each other.
Now, despite the really deep social divides that would later define them, early managers like Rangers' legendary Bill Struth and Celtic's Willie Maley actually shared a mutual respect. Both had backgrounds in amateur athletics, and they really pushed each other to greatness. As Struth so eloquently put it, they welcomed the chase, showing us a rivalry that was initially rooted in healthy competition rather than outright hostility.
So, the absolutely crucial point to understand here is their combined dominance. Together, Celtic and Rangers have amassed a staggering 111 Scottish League championships. They have practically monopolized the sport in Scotland, ensuring that almost every single year the title runs straight through Glasgow. This zero-sum game only amplified the pressure every single time they met.
Section 3. Sectarianism and Fan Culture.
As Glasgow modernized over the years, this geographic separation really solidified into an undeniable social fault line. Celtic became the symbol for Irish Catholic immigrants, proudly flying the Irish tricolour and wearing green and white. Rangers, bolstered by those shipyard communities, became the emblem of Protestant unionism, flying the Union Jack and playing in royal blue. The stadiums themselves, Celtic Park in the East End and Ibrox in Govan, stood as physical monuments to these separate worlds.
Looking over the decades, we can actually trace a pretty clear escalation of these sectarian tensions. For instance, in 1912, the Belfast shipbuilding giant Harland & Wolff opened a yard in Govan, bringing a massive influx of Ulster Protestant workers and really hardening Rangers' unionist identity. For decades, Rangers maintained this unwritten rule of not signing Catholic players, but that barrier was finally shattered in 1989 by manager Graham Souness when he signed Mo Johnston, a Catholic and a former Celtic player. But the rivalry also saw some incredibly dark moments of fan disorder, most notably an on-pitch battle between hundreds of fans at Hampden Park in 1980. That incident directly resulted in a nationwide ban on alcohol in Scottish football grounds.
Now, it is a matter of factual record that this sectarianism, which, to be totally clear, is absolutely not practiced by all the fans, has driven some deep social issues in Glasgow.
Police have frequently reported spikes in disorder on Old Firm weekends, and this has actually prompted multiple legislative efforts by the Scottish government to curb offensive behavior and chants at these matches.
Section 4. The 1971 Ibrox disaster.
We need to shift our focus now to the darkest day in the history of the Old Firm. It was a profound tragedy that completely transcended the sporting rivalry and united the entire city of Glasgow in shared grief. On January 2, 1971, 66 lives were lost in a devastating crowd crush on Stairway 13 at Ibrox Stadium. The victims were mostly young men and boys, including an 8-year-old child named Nigel Pickup. It was the absolute worst British football disaster of its time, an event of unimaginable heartbreak.
When we look closely at the final minutes of that match, we can see exactly how a sudden reversal in crowd flow caused the catastrophe. In the 89th minute, Celtic scored, prompting disappointed Rangers fans to begin exiting down the steep, narrow Stairway 13. But, deep in injury time, Rangers scored a dramatic equalizer. The immense roar of the stadium caused fans on the stairs to instinctively turn back up to see what had happened, creating a deadly bidirectional counterflow, literally people pushing up colliding with people pushing down.
The sheer mechanical failure of those barriers, which were utterly unable to withstand the dynamic load of tens of thousands of surging fans, highlighted some fatal flaws in stadium engineering. The steel barriers buckled and collapsed, causing a horrific pileup. Medical reports confirmed that 60 of the victims died from traumatic asphyxia due to extreme chest compression. And amidst the horror, fans, police, and even the team managers formed human chains, just desperately pulling people from the wreckage.
But the legacy of those 66 victims does live on through some incredibly sweeping legislative and structural reforms. The government commissioned the 1972 Wheatley Report, which exposed severe, systemic safety neglect in football grounds. This led directly to the 1975 Safety of Sports Grounds Act, forcing clubs to obtain safety certificates and adhere to strict capacity limits. Following this, Rangers undertook a massive reconstruction of Ibrox, eliminating the dangerous standing terraces in favor of modern all-seated areas, permanently changing how football grounds operate across the UK.
Section 5. Liquidation and the journey.
Let's fast forward a bit to the modern era, where the rivalry faced an entirely unprecedented upheaval. And this time, it wasn't on the pitch, it was in the boardroom. In 2012, this catastrophic financial failure absolutely shocked the global football world. Rangers, an institution with over a century of history, was forced into liquidation. For the very first time in 120 years, the Old Firm derby was literally erased from the sporting calendar.
What followed that collapse was a really grueling 4-year process that Rangers fans passionately refer to as the journey. The club was forced to start completely over in the 3rd division, which is the lowest tier of Scottish professional football. Step by step, playing in small, part-time venues, and surviving ongoing boardroom drama, Rangers battled their way up the leagues, finally securing promotion back to the Scottish Premiership in 2016 to renew the derby.
And you know, this era added a totally fascinating new layer to the rivalry, the decode debate. Because the holding company was liquidated and the sporting assets were bought by a new company, rival fans, particularly Celtic supporters, argue that the post-2012 Rangers is a completely different entity, often calling it a dead club, or Sevco. Conversely, Rangers fans and the football governing bodies maintain it is the exact same historic institution, playing in the same colors, in the same stadium, with the exact same legacy. It's an intense, ongoing debate over corporate continuity and sporting identity.
Yet despite the liquidation controversy, or honestly the decades of social strife, the gravitational pull of these two clubs remains the absolute defining force in Scotland. Together, they are an economic powerhouse, injecting over $120 million into the Scottish economy annually. Their success basically funds the ecosystem of the sport in the nation.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider how an immense rivalry born from a 15-inch muddy river has survived absolutely everything, from religious division and devastating tragedy to complete financial ruin. The physical boundaries of the River Clyde have long been conquered by modern bridges, yet the psychological lines drawn centuries ago still echo on match days. Which leaves us to wonder, what exactly will drive the passion, the tension, and the glory of the Old Firm in the century to come? Keep seeking the answers, and thanks so much for learning with us today.